The wind swept across the snow-covered valley like a lonely song that no one remained to hear. White drifts stretched over the open prairie, covering old wagon tracks, broken fences, and forgotten footprints from seasons long gone. Winter had settled hard over the frontier, and the little settlement of Willow Creek seemed almost asleep. Beneath the endless blanket of snow, smoke rose gently from only a handful of chimneys, each carrying the promise of warmth against the bitter cold. Among those modest homes stood a small wooden cabin with a weathered porch and a single lantern hanging beside the door. Inside lived Emily Harper, a young widow who had learned far too early that life on the frontier could take away everything except faith. Every morning before sunrise, Emily lit the oil lamp, stirred the fire in the cast-iron stove, and whispered a quiet prayer before beginning another day. She had once shared this cabin with her husband Daniel, a kind rancher whose laughter had filled every corner of the home. 3 winters earlier, a terrible fever had swept through the valley. By spring, Daniel was gone, leaving Emily alone with memories, unpaid debts, and a ranch too large for one pair of hands. Many believed she would sell the land and leave. Instead, she stayed. She repaired broken fences herself. She chopped firewood until her hands blistered. She planted vegetables every spring and baked bread every morning. The townsfolk admired her courage, though few truly understood how lonely the nights became when the fire burned. Low and only silence answered her thoughts. Miles away, another lonely soul wandered across the frozen prairie. Jacob Carter had once been known as one of the finest cowboys in 3 territories. He could calm the wildest horse, drive cattle through raging storms, and survive weeks alone beneath the open sky. Yet none of those skills could protect him from heartbreak. Years earlier, bandits had destroyed the ranch where he worked, and everyone he had considered family scattered across the West. Since then, Jacob had drifted from town to town, working wherever honest labor could be found. He owned little more than his faithful horse, a worn leather coat, an old revolver he prayed never to use, and the black cowboy hat he removed whenever kindness crossed his path. For weeks, work had been impossible to find. Heavy snow had stopped cattle drives. Ranchers struggled simply to feed their own livestock. Jacob's savings disappeared one meal at a time. Now even his horse showed signs of exhaustion. As daylight faded behind gray winter clouds, Jacob pulled his coat tighter against the freezing wind. Snowflakes clung to his beard while icy air burned his lungs with every breath. His stomach had been empty since sunrise. He looked toward the horizon. Nothing, only snow. Then something caught his eye. A thin ribbon of smoke curled into the winter sky. A cabin. His tired horse lifted its head as though it too smelled hope carried on the cold wind. Jacob hesitated. He had spent years refusing charity. Pride often kept hungry men hungry, but pride could not fill an empty stomach. Slowly, he guided his horse toward the distant chimney. Meanwhile, Emily removed a fresh loaf of bread from the oven. The warm scent filled the cabin, mixing with simmering beans and herbs cooking over the fire. She prepared only enough food for herself, yet she always set an extra plate on the table. It had become a habit she never abandoned. Perhaps one day, she thought, someone who truly needed a meal might appear. A sudden knock echoed against the wooden door. Emily froze. Visitors were rare during winter. Another knock came, softer this time. She picked up the lantern and carefully opened the door. Standing outside was a tall cowboy covered in snow. His face looked worn by years of hardship. His boots were cracked. His gloves were nearly threadbare. He held his black hat respectfully against his chest instead of wearing it. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Emily noticed something that touched her heart. The cowboy wasn't looking past her into the warm cabin. He wasn't staring at the food. He simply lowered his eyes politely, as though afraid to be a burden. Finally he spoke. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to trouble you." His voice carried the weight of many lonely miles. "My horse and I have traveled all day." He paused. "If there's a well nearby, I'd be grateful just for a little water." Emily looked beyond him. The poor horse trembled from cold and exhaustion. Without thinking, she asked the simplest question anyone had spoken to Jacob in many months. "Have you eaten?" Jacob swallowed. He wanted to answer yes. Instead, honesty escaped before pride could stop it. "No, ma'am." Emily smiled gently. Then standing out there won't help either of us. She stepped aside. Please, come inside. Jacob hesitated. You don't even know me. I know what hunger looks like, Emily replied softly. And that's enough. Jacob slowly entered the cabin, carefully removing his boots so he wouldn't bring snow across the wooden floor. Warmth wrapped around him immediately. It had been weeks since he had stood beside a real fireplace. Emily placed another log onto the fire before setting a steaming bowl of beans, fresh bread, and hot coffee on the table. Jacob stared at the meal. For a long moment, he didn't move. Emily wondered if something was wrong. Instead, Jacob quietly bowed his head. He whispered a prayer so softly she almost couldn't hear it. Thank you, Lord ... for reminding me kindness still lives somewhere. Emily pretended not to notice the tears gathering in his tired eyes. She simply sat across the table. Eat while it's warm. Jacob took one careful bite, then another. Soon he realized how hungry he truly was. Emily watched silently, saying nothing that might embarrass him. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, the lonely cabin no longer felt quite so empty. As they finished supper, conversation slowly began. Jacob thanked her again and again. Emily simply smiled. My father always said no one should leave this house hungry. Jacob looked around the room. Shelves lined with folded quilts, old family photographs, a worn Bible resting beside the fireplace. Everything felt peaceful. Everything felt like the home he thought he'd lost forever. After a while, Emily asked, "Where are you headed?" Jacob gave a tired smile. I've been asking myself that same question for years. Silence settled between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, the kind shared by two people who understood loneliness without needing to explain it. When the wind outside grew stronger, Emily looked through the frosted window. The storm's getting worse. Jacob immediately stood. I should leave before I overstay my welcome. Emily looked at him as though he had suggested sleeping outside in the snow. Leave. I couldn't ask for more. You haven't asked for anything. Jacob remained quiet. Emily folded her arms. The barn has room for your horse. The spare room has a bed. And tomorrow will still be there. For the first time in years, Jacob didn't know what to say. No ranch owner had offered him more than a night's wages. No stranger had offered him trust. Emily had offered both. Finally he nodded. Thank you. That evening, after feeding his grateful horse and settling into the small guest room, Jacob looked through the window toward the snowy valley. The storm had become fierce. Had he continued riding, neither he nor his horse would likely have survived until morning. He quietly whispered another prayer. Perhaps, just perhaps, God hadn't led him to this cabin by accident. Jacob Carter had slept beneath countless stars, inside abandoned barns, beside dying campfires, and under wagons during violent storms. But that night, in the small guest room of Emily Harper's cabin, he slept in a real bed for the first time in many months. The howling wind battered the cabin walls, yet inside there was only warmth, the crackling of firewood, and a peace he had almost forgotten existed. Long before sunrise, he awoke out of habit. Cowboys learned never to waste daylight, no matter how cold the morning. He quietly dressed, careful not to wake Emily. Through the frosted window, he saw the ranch blanketed in fresh snow. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world shining beneath the first golden light of dawn. Jacob stepped outside and breathed deeply. The cold air stung his face, but it carried the fresh scent of pine and clean snow. His horse greeted him with a soft neigh from the barn, healthier already after a warm stall, fresh hay and clean water. Jacob smiled and gently rubbed the horse's neck. You've had a better night than we've seen in a long time, old friend. Instead of preparing to leave immediately, Jacob noticed broken fence, posts half buried beneath the snow. One gate leaned dangerously to one side. Firewood beside the cabin had nearly run out. Without saying a word, he picked up an axe and began chopping wood. Inside the cabin, Emily awoke to the steady sound of splitting logs. Curious, she looked out the window. There stood Jacob, working before sunrise as though the ranch belonged to him. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the freezing air. Piles of neatly stacked firewood grew beside the porch with every passing minute. Emily couldn't help but smile. He didn't have to do that, she whispered. She prepared breakfast of eggs, biscuits, fried potatoes, and hot coffee before stepping onto the porch. Mr. Carter, Jacob immediately stopped working. "I'm sorry if the noise woke you." "It did." He looked embarrassed. "I thought I'd earned last night's supper." Emily laughed softly. "You've already chopped enough wood for a week." Jacob shrugged. "It still doesn't feel like enough." Over breakfast they talked more than they had the night before. Emily learned Jacob had spent nearly 15 years riding across the frontier, working from ranch to ranch. He rarely stayed anywhere longer than a season. Whenever people asked where his family lived, he simply answered, "Wherever God has taken them." Emily understood that answer better than most. After breakfast, Jacob insisted on repairing the broken fence before leaving. Emily protested, but he smiled. A cowboy feels restless when he sees broken fences. She finally agreed. For the rest of the morning, Jacob worked tirelessly. He straightened leaning posts, repaired loose rails, reinforced the barn door, and even fixed the old water pump that had frozen repeatedly throughout the winter. Emily watched from the porch. Her late husband had possessed those same quiet habits, never speaking much, always fixing whatever needed fixing. Not because anyone asked, because it simply felt right. By afternoon, several neighboring ranchers rode past the Harper property. They slowed their horses in surprise. "Emily," called old Mr. Wilson, "looks like you've hired yourself a fine ranch hand." Emily smiled politely. He was only passing through. Mr. Wilson glanced toward Jacob. "Well, whoever he is, he's done more work in one morning than some hired men do in a week." Jacob simply tipped his hat. Praise had never meant much to him. Honest work was its own reward. Later that afternoon, Emily carried fresh coffee out to the fence line where Jacob was finishing repairs. "You've worked all day. So have you." "I only cooked." Jacob shook his head. "A warm meal is harder to find than broken fences." Emily laughed again. She hadn't laughed this often in years. As evening approached, Jacob saddled his horse. Emily stood quietly beside the porch. Jacob looked toward the open prairie stretching westward. "I suppose it's time." Emily nodded. "I figured you'd say that." Neither of them moved. The silence lasted longer than either expected. Finally, Emily spoke. "Where will you go?" Jacob looked across the endless snowy landscape. "I honestly don't know." "Do you have work waiting?" "No." "Family?" "No." "A place to stay?" Jacob gave a tired smile. "I usually figure that part out after I arrive." Emily lowered her eyes. The answer saddened her more than she expected. Just then another rider galloped into the yard. It was Ben Thompson, owner of one of the largest cattle ranches in the valley. His horse stopped beside the porch. "Afternoon, Emily." He nodded toward Jacob. "You're the fellow fixing fences?" Jacob stepped forward. "Yes, sir." Ben looked around the property. "I've been hearing about you all day." Jacob looked confused. "Hearing what?" "That you've repaired half this ranch without asking for a penny." Jacob shrugged. "It needed doing." Ben smiled. "Would you be interested in work?" Jacob looked surprised. "What kind?" "My ranch lost 3 hands before winter." "When would you want me to start?" Ben laughed. "Tomorrow morning." Jacob glanced toward Emily. For the first time in years, someone had offered him steady work instead of temporary wages. Ben continued. "Good pay, warm bunkhouse, meals included." Jacob thanked him sincerely. "I'll think about it tonight." "Fair enough." Ben rode away. Emily looked hopeful. "That's wonderful." "It is. But," Jacob sighed, "I've spent so many years leaving places ... I'm not sure I remember how to stay." That evening they shared another quiet supper. This time conversation came easily. Emily told stories about her husband, Daniel. Jacob listened respectfully. He spoke of old cattle drives, mountain storms, and friends whose graves now rested across the frontier. Neither tried to hide the pain of the past. Instead, they shared it. Somehow, speaking those memories aloud made them a little lighter. After supper, Jacob stood near the fireplace. "You know," Emily looked up. "What?" "I almost rode past this cabin yesterday." Emily smiled gently. "What stopped you?" Jacob thought for a long moment. "The smoke from your chimney." Emily laughed softly. "I almost didn't light the stove that early." Jacob looked into the dancing fire. Funny how small decisions change lives. Outside, the stars shone brilliantly over the silent valley. Inside, two lonely hearts were beginning to discover something neither expected. Not romance. Not yet. Something even more important. Trust. For the first time since losing Daniel, Emily didn't dread tomorrow. For the first time since losing everything, Jacob didn't feel like a man with nowhere to belong. Yet neither realized that beyond the peaceful valley, trouble was already making its way toward Willow Creek. Men from Jacob's past had learned he was alive, and they carried unfinished business that would soon test everything he and Emily had begun to build. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Sunlight sparkled across the snow-covered valley, making Willow Creek look peaceful enough to forget that danger could ever find its way there. Jacob rose before sunrise once again, fed his horse, and stood quietly on the porch with a mug of hot coffee. Emily joined him a few moments later. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable, like to old friends watching the day begin. Jacob finally turned toward her. "I've made my decision." Emily smiled nervously. "About Mr. Thompson's offer?" He nodded. "I'm going to stay." Emily's eyes filled with quiet happiness. "I think Willow Creek could use another honest cowboy." Jacob smiled. "And I think I finally found a reason to stop riding." Before either could say another word, the sound of galloping horses echoed across the valley. 3 riders appeared on the snowy road. Jacob's smile disappeared instantly. He recognized them. The leader was Wade Mercer, a ruthless outlaw Jacob had crossed years earlier while protecting a ranch family from a robbery. Wade had never forgotten the humiliation of being defeated by a single cowboy. The 3 men stopped in front of Emily's cabin. Wade grinned. "Well, look who finally stopped running." Jacob stepped away from the porch. "I wasn't running." "No." Wade laughed. "Then why disappear for 5 years?" "I was living my life." Wade's eyes shifted toward Emily. "And who's she?" Jacob answered firmly. "Someone you leave alone." Emily had never seen Jacob like this. His calm voice remained steady, but every muscle in his body stood ready. Wade climbed off his horse. "You still owe me." "I owe you nothing. You cost me a fortune. You earned every bit of it." The outlaw's smile vanished. Without warning, Wade swung a punch. Jacob dodged it easily. The fight exploded across the snowy yard. The other 2 outlaws rushed forward. Jacob had spent years working as a cowboy, but life on the frontier had taught him how to defend himself. He blocked one attack, knocked another man into the snow, and stood his ground despite being outnumbered. Emily ran toward the barn, not to hide. She rang the large iron bell Daniel had once used whenever ranch hands were needed. Its loud clang echoed through the valley. Neighboring ranchers looked up from their work. They recognized the signal immediately. Within minutes, riders began arriving from every direction. Ben Thompson arrived first, then old Mr. Wilson, then half a dozen ranchers Jacob had met only briefly. They formed a line beside Jacob. Ben looked directly at Wade. "Looks like you've picked the wrong ranch." Wade glanced around. The odds had changed. He climbed back onto his horse. "This isn't over." Jacob answered calmly. "It is if you never come back." The 3 outlaws rode away without another word. Silence returned. Ben placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Seems you've made yourself some friends." Jacob looked around. Only days earlier he had entered Willow Creek as a hungry stranger. Now people stood beside him without hesitation. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Over the following weeks, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Jacob accepted Ben Thompson's job but spent every evening helping Emily around the ranch. Together they repaired the old barn. They rebuilt fences. They planted a spring garden as the snow slowly melted. Neighbors noticed something changing. Emily smiled more often. Jacob laughed again. The lonely cabin became a gathering place where travelers knew they would always receive a warm meal. One rainy afternoon, Emily found Jacob repairing the porch swing Daniel had built years before. "You've fixed almost everything on this ranch." Jacob smiled. "Not everything." "What did I miss?" He looked at her kindly. "The loneliness." Emily lowered her eyes. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally Jacob removed his hat. "The first day I came here... You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask what I'd done. You didn't ask whether I had money." Emily smiled softly. "I asked if you'd eaten." Jacob nodded. "And that question changed my life." He took a slow breath. "I've spent years searching for work, but I realize now... I wasn't searching for work. I was searching for home." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "You found it." Jacob looked at the little cabin, the porch, the barn. the smoke rising from the chimney, the woman whose kindness had rescued a stranger without expecting anything in return. He smiled. I did. Months passed. Spring covered the valley with green grass and wildflowers. The lonely winter seemed like a distant memory. One Sunday after church, the people of Willow Creek gathered beneath the large oak tree in the town square. Ben Thompson cleared his throat. I've got an announcement. Everyone turned. Ben smiled. I believe these two have kept us waiting long enough. The crowd laughed. Jacob looked at Emily. She laughed too. Then Jacob slowly knelt on one knee. He held out a simple silver ring that had belonged to his mother. Emily Harper, you gave a hungry cowboy a meal. You gave a lonely man hope. You gave a wandering soul a reason to stay. Will you marry me? Emily covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. Without hesitation she whispered ... Yes. The entire town erupted into cheers. A few weeks later, the little cabin that had once echoed with silence overflowed with laughter. Friends filled every chair. Children played outside. Music drifted through the open windows. Jacob and Emily stood together on the porch as the sun set across the valley. Jacob wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Emily rested her head against him. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes the greatest miracles begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Not a fortune, not a heroic speech, not an act of great power. Just 5 simple words. Have you eaten? For one lonely cowboy, those words became the beginning of a brand new life. And for one grieving widow, opening her door to a stranger filled her home with love once again. Some journeys end with treasure, some end with victory, but the best journeys end with a place to belong. And beneath the wide western sky, surrounded by friends, faith, and family, Jacob Carter finally found what he had been searching for all along. He found home. Thank you for watching this story. If Jacob and Emily's journey touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps us create more heartwarming Old West stories every week. May God bless you, and we'll see you in the next adventure.